30 minutes outside Austin, where the city's tech optimism fades into long, sunburned stretches of farmland, there stands a place that now feels less like a construction site and more like a warning carved into the soil. Drive down Farm to Market Road 973, and you don't see the future anymore. You see silence. Steel frames rise and then abruptly stop, as if time itself slammed on the brakes. Bulldozers sit frozen mid-task. Cranes loom over empty concrete pads like abandoned sentries. The parking lots, built to hold thousands of workers, bake untouched under a merciless Texas sun. This was supposed to be the Taylor Fab, a project so vast and ambitious that it was sold to the American public as nothing less than a rebirth of U.S. industrial power. 1,200 acres, 11 football fields under one roof. A fortress of silicon and circuitry meant to anchor American dominance in the most important industry on Earth. And then, without ceremony, without warning, it stopped. The machines went quiet. The gates were chained. The promise collapsed inward on itself. By the time most Americans poured their first cup of coffee this morning, the decision had already detonated across global markets and government offices. Samsung Electronics, the crown jewel foreign investor in the U.S. semiconductor revival, had pulled the plug. The single largest foreign direct investment in Texas history, $25 billion in active capital, was gone. Not delayed, not under review. Gone. And the shock wasn't just about the money, it was about where that money was going. Not back to South Korea, not to Europe, not to Japan. Instead, it was heading straight across the northern border into a country Washington once assumed would always stay politely in its shadow. In Toronto, under bright lights and a global press corps that could barely keep up, Samsung executives stood shoulder to shoulder with Mark Carney. There was no ambiguity in the announcement, no diplomatic fog. Canada, they declared, would become the exclusive North American hub for advanced logic chips, not a secondary site, not a backup. The hub, the room reportedly went quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't just an investment shift, it was a tectonic realignment. Years of American policy, billions in subsidies, and the centerpiece of a national security strategy had just been outmaneuvered in real time. For Donald Trump, the move landed like a direct challenge. His administration had spent months trying to corner the global semiconductor market with threats, tariffs, and midnight ultimatums. The assumption was simple and blunt. The United States was too big, too rich, too essential to ignore. South Korea, the thinking went, would eventually bend. The sunk costs were too high, the leverage too overwhelming. But leverage only works when the other side believes you are the safest option. And somewhere along the line, Washington forgot that. What unfolded next was not a sudden betrayal, but a slow-motion failure years in the making. To understand why this collapse matters, and why it will touch everything from the price of your next car to the stability of global power, you have to understand what semiconductors really are. They aren't just components. They are the oil of the 21st century. Every smartphone, every data center, every artificial intelligence model, every modern weapon system depends on advanced logic chips. The specific 2nm and 4nm chips the Taylor facility was designed to produce sit at the very edge of human manufacturing capability. Without them, phones go dark, AI progress stalls, and the digital backbone of the modern world begins to crack. For Washington, the stakes were existential. The United States has spent years grappling with the realization that it outsourced the heart of its technological power. Factories moved offshore, supply chains stretched across oceans, efficiency replaced resilience. When global disruptions hit, the fragility of that system was laid bare. The response was the CHIPS Act, billions in incentives meant to bring manufacturing home. Samsung's Texas fab was the anchor of that entire strategy, the proof that the plan could work. Dirt was moving. Concrete was pouring. Local officials in Williamson County spoke openly about 20,000 new jobs. Housing prices soared. Small businesses expanded. The future, they were told, had arrived. Then, the rules changed. In the final weeks before the collapse, pressure from Washington intensified. Under the banner of America First, the administration demanded more than a factory. Samsung was told to rewire its global supply chains, sever ties with certain international partners, and prioritize American buyers at government-mandated discounts. Billions in promised subsidies were suddenly framed as leverage, threatened with clawbacks if new unilateral tariffs weren't accepted. What had been pitched as a partnership began to feel like a shakedown. The message was clear: comply fully or pay the price. The calculation in Washington was that Samsung couldn't walk away. Too much money had already been spent, too much concrete poured, too many political announcements made. The factory, they believed, was a hostage that guaranteed obedience. But Samsung is not a local contractor. It is one of the most sophisticated and powerful technology firms on the planet, backed by a state that understands long-term strategy. From Seoul's perspective, the volatility coming out of Washington was no longer noise. It was risk, policy whiplash, tariff threats, the knowledge that every election cycle could turn a multi-billion-dollar investment into a political weapon, Doing business in the United States was beginning to look like operating inside a permanent storm, and then Ottawa made the call. While the White House issued ultimatums and fought trade battles in public, Carney moved quietly. He didn't posture, he didn't threaten. He listened. He understood something Washington had forgotten. Global capital doesn't just chase subsidies. It chases stability. Canada's pitch wasn't louder, it was calmer. It wasn't about nationalism. It was about systems. Predictable regulation. Long-term agreements that wouldn't be rewritten at 3 a.m. by a social media post. Respect between sovereign partners. The offer went deeper than tax incentives. Semiconductor fabs consume staggering amounts of resources, millions of gallons of fresh water every single day, massive uninterrupted flows of electricity. Canada could offer both at scale. Through the Great Lakes, it controls a fifth of the world's fresh water. Through Quebec and Ontario, it operates some of the cleanest, most stable hydroelectric grids on the planet. These weren't promises, they were physical realities. Add to that synchronized regulations, tariff-free access to European markets, and integration into Canada's evolving defense industrial strategy, and the choice became less about politics and more about physics. Most importantly, Carney offered something intangible but decisive: certainty. Samsung wouldn't be treated as a subordinate, it wouldn't be strong-armed or publicly humiliated. The rules would be clear, and they would hold. In a world of accelerating chaos, that predictability became priceless. The ink dried. The capital moved. Texas lost its tech crown. Ontario inherited a future measured not in speeches but in supply chains. The consequences were immediate and brutal. In Taylor, Texas, stop work orders rippled outward before sunrise. Contractors were told to shut down. Thousands of workers packed up tools they'd expected to use for years. Local suppliers who had taken out massive loans to service the facility suddenly faced insolvency. Billions in projected tax revenue evaporated. The real estate market, inflated by the promise of high-tech jobs, froze overnight. Families who had relocated for opportunity found themselves stranded. This wasn't a theoretical loss, it was wealth destruction, instantaneous and personal. Markets responded just as quickly. Global investors hate uncertainty, and they delivered a verdict. As the Toronto press conference unfolded, the US dollar slipped against major currencies while the Canadian dollar surged. Tech stocks bled red. Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft. The assumption that America could bully its way to semiconductor independence cracked in full view of the world. The AI boom, built on the expectation of abundant advanced chips, suddenly looked fragile. Capital began to flow north, leaving American retail investors exposed to the downside. But the deepest panic wasn't visible on trading screens. It was happening behind closed doors at the Pentagon. The chips Samsung was supposed to produce in Texas weren't just for consumer electronics. They were destined for advanced targeting systems, drone swarms, encrypted communications, and next-generation fighter jets. Semiconductors are weapons. By losing the factory, the United States didn't just lose jobs, it lost a measure of strategic autonomy. Yes, Canada is an ally, but allies with leverage negotiate from strength. The uncomfortable reality for Washington is that future access to critical chips may now require asking permission and paying a premium. This is where the story widens beyond one factory or one deal. What we are witnessing is a realignment of power driven not by ideology, but by trust. The old assumption that the United States is the inevitable center of the global order is eroding. Not because America lacks resources or talent, but because predictability has become scarce. Capital, supply chains, and strategic industries are moving toward environments where long-term planning is possible. For decades, the American empire was built on being the safest bet. The rules might be tough, but they were stable. That stability attracted the world's most critical industries. When that stability faltered, alternatives emerged. Canada didn't seize this moment with bluster, it seized it with patience. And in doing so, it exposed a vulnerability that goes far beyond semiconductors. The ripple effects will reach ordinary consumers faster than many expect. Fewer domestic chips mean tighter supply. Tighter supply means higher prices. Cars, phones, computers, anything that depends on advanced silicon will feel the squeeze. Innovation timelines will stretch, military procurement will grow more complex. And the psychological impact, the realization that America can no longer assume automatic leadership, will shape policy debates for years. This isn't the end of American power, but it is a warning. Power in the modern world doesn't just come from size or threats. It comes from being reliable when others are volatile, from honoring long-term commitments when short-term politics tempt disruption. The Taylor fab now stands as a monument not just to a broken promise, but to a lesson written in steel and concrete. In the 21st century, the nations that win aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that make the future feel safe. History rarely announces itself politely. Sometimes it whispers through empty parking lots and silent cranes. Sometimes it moves $25 billion across a border while the world is still arguing about yesterday's headlines. And sometimes, if you know where to look, out can see the shape of the next global order forming in the quiet spaces where a promise once stood. And finally, there is receipt number 4, the one that doesn't just sting Washington but openly humiliates it. The official Seoul-Ottawa Accord, buried beneath the careful language of diplomatic press releases, is anything but subtle if you know how to read it. In its statement, South Korea went out of its way to praise Canada for its unwavering commitment to free enterprise, for its stable and predictable regulatory environment, and for its respect for international supply chain integrity. Those words are not compliments in the casual sense. They are signals. They are coded messages meant for boardrooms, finance ministries, and CEOs across the globe. Translated into plain language, they say this: South Korea is leaving the United States because the United States is no longer a safe, reliable place to do business. It is an open invitation, an advertisement broadcast to every major technology company on Earth, telling them that the future no longer runs through America. It runs somewhere else. This single document exposes the core reason why Donald Trump is losing control of the economic narrative in real time, and why the worldview that has defined his approach to global power is collapsing under its own weight. His strategy is rooted in a deeply outdated understanding of how influence works. He sees international trade as a zero-sum contest of dominance and submission, a crude game where one side must lose so the other can win. In his mind, power is exercised through escalation, through threats, tariffs, public humiliation, and televised confrontation. He assumes that if the pressure becomes loud enough and relentless enough, the other side will eventually cave simply because America is large, wealthy, and historically powerful. It is the mentality of a landlord who believes tenants can be abused indefinitely because they have nowhere else to go. But the world has changed, and it has adapted. When a country repeatedly weaponizes its economy, when it turns alliances into leverage and partnerships into hostages, the response is not submission. The response is diversification. Partners quietly begin building alternatives. They lay new foundations, forge new corridors, and design new systems that reduce their exposure to volatility. Trump threatened South Korea with tariffs and subsidy clawbacks, convinced that fear would force deeper loyalty. Instead, it triggered a ruthless risk assessment in Seoul. The boardrooms of Samsung Electronics, staffed by some of the sharpest financial minds on the planet, ran the numbers. They weighed the rising costs, the political interference, the unpredictability of Washington, and the reality that a $25 billion investment could be turned into a political bargaining chip at any moment. Their conclusion was not emotional or ideological. It was mathematical. The United States was no longer a safe harbor for a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar project. Trump squeezed for control, and the glass shattered in his hands. The prize slipped away, and the vacuum he created was immediately filled. That vacuum was filled by Mark Carney, and this is where the contrast becomes devastating. Carney does not operate on impulse. He does not govern through spectacle. His instincts are those of a former central banker, cold, methodical, and relentlessly focused on systems rather than sound bites. You will never see him threatening an allied nation on television or firing off insults in the middle of the night. Instead, he builds frameworks. He aligns incentives. He understands a simple truth of the modern global economy. Capital flows to stability the way water flows downhill. Over the past year, Carney has been positioning Canada not as a rival superpower, but as the indispensable middle power, the place exhausted nations can turn when American volatility becomes unbearable. He has quietly woven a network stretching from the United Kingdom to Japan to South Korea, linking countries that are tired of erratic policy swings and transactional diplomacy. What he offers is not dominance, but refuge. A parallel system where contracts are honored, where trade is structured around mutual benefit, and where the rule of law is not hostage to the daily moods of a single leader. By securing the Samsung deal, Carney didn't just win a factory. He captured the narrative. He demonstrated that credibility, not coercion, is the true currency of the 21st century. You don't need the largest military or the biggest consumer market to shape the future. You need to be trusted. Right now, Canada is trusted. The United States is not. The implications of this shift are not abstract. They are not limited to diplomats or investors. They will reach directly into the lives of ordinary people, even those who have never heard of Taylor, Texas, or couldn't explain what a nanometer is. The United States has effectively lost control of its supply chain for the most critical component of the modern world. With Samsung's advanced production moving north, the chips that power American industry will now cross borders before they reach U.S. factories. That alone introduces friction. And if Trump follows through on his threats of universal tariffs against Canadian exports, the situation becomes self-destructive. The United States would be taxing the very technology its own companies depend on. Think about Detroit. Modern vehicles contain thousands of semiconductors controlling everything from braking systems to battery management. If manufacturers like Ford and General Motors are forced to pay steep tariffs on Canadian-made chips, the cost doesn't disappear. It gets passed on. Truck prices jump by thousands of dollars. Medical imaging equipment becomes more expensive. Upgrading the power grid costs more. The laptops children need for school double in price. Inflation, once thought to be contained, absorbs a secondary shockwave simply because America must now import what it was supposed to build at home. The country ends up paying a premium just to access the future. On a deeper level, this moment signals something far more unsettling: a collapse in perceived American leadership. For decades, the United States was the unquestioned destination for global ambition. If you were building the future, you built it in America. Talent flowed in, capital followed, innovation clustered. Today, South Korea looked at the United States and declined. Not out of hostility, but out of caution. You are too risky, was the message. You are too unpredictable. That judgment alone should terrify policymakers far more than any tariff dispute. There is an image from today that captures this reversal with brutal clarity. In Texas, cameras lingered on the skeletal frame of the unfinished fab, silent against the sky. A lone security guard slowly chained the front gate shut. Beside it, a faded banner flapped in the heat, reading, "Building America's Future." At the same moment, screens split to show Carney in Toronto shaking hands with Samsung's leadership in a sleek boardroom, Canadian and South Korean flags standing tall behind them. Trump did not negotiate, he demanded, and the world simply stepped around him and handed the future to someone else. So what happens next? In moments like this, leaders usually try to calm markets, reopen back channels, and engineer a face-saving compromise. But this administration has never operated that way. Three scenarios are unfolding simultaneously, and none of them end well for the American consumer. The first is the tariff death spiral. This is the most likely path. Trump takes the move as a personal insult and responds with punitive measures. Auto tariffs on Hyundai and Kia, threats against Canada, border disruptions. Each escalation validates Samsung's decision and convinces other investors to stay away. The second scenario is a revolt from America's own corporate elite. Executives from Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon suddenly realize their hardware roadmaps are at risk. They pressure the White House to reverse course, to stabilize trade policy, to repair trust. But by then, the damage may be irreversible. Concrete will already be pouring in Ontario, contracts will already be signed. Trust, once broken at a global scale, does not snap back into place. The third scenario is the most transformative and the most dangerous for Washington. Canada, the UK, South Korea, and Japan accelerate integration, forming a closed-loop technological alliance. They share research, trade freely, and set standards together, leaving the United States isolated as a massive consumer market with dwindling production capacity. In this future, America falls behind in the AI race and spends the next decade importing advanced technology from places it once assumed would always follow its lead, paying whatever price is demanded. We are in uncharted waters. The global order is being rewritten in real time, and the United States is no longer holding the pen. Carney has executed a masterclass in strategy, converting American pressure into Canadian leverage. He protected his country by offering stability to those burned by volatility, and in doing so, he secured Canada's economic position for generations. Whether this move ultimately stabilizes global supply chains or dares Trump into further isolation remains to be seen. What is clear is this: an era may have ended today, not with a war, not with a crash, but with a signature and the quiet realization that credibility now matters more than force.